Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the FIREANGEL Safety Technology Group Interim Results Investor Presentation. Throughout this presentation, investors will be on listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged and can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Simply type in your question in the box below and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company will review all questions submitted today and publish responses where it's appropriate to do so. These will be available via your Investor Meet Company dashboard. I'd also like to remind you that this presentation is being recorded. Before we begin, I'd like to submit the following poll. I would now like to hand over to John Connolly, Chairman, and Mike Stillwell, CFO of FIREANGEL. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for that introduction. And we'll go straight to the first proper chart of the presentation. So in a difficult year, the key highlight of the period has been securing our first large-scale order for our new connected home technology. That's with a large London Borough Council and should enable them to roll out the technology to 3,000 or 4,000 of their properties, and they have a full estate of around 16,000. So we fully expect to receive further purchase orders in due course over the next 3 years, should we be successful in delivering this in the right way. And we've certainly been working hard on it. Installation is expected to start any day now. We've been working very closely with this council for some time to get this right. And it's very different from the sort of alarm installation we're all used to doing in our own homes, where we might have bought an alarm for £10 or £20. The contrast with an order of £1 million gives you the idea, but this is much more akin to a low-end IT project than supplying the standard B&Q with alarms. The wider interest continues. It became quite suppressed, obviously, during the COVID period. And we have meetings this week and next week with people who've had a long-standing interest to re-qualify what they want to do next and hopefully restore that momentum. Notably, however, we have received and installed orders for 2 large tower blocks on the south coast. It's an order only for about £50,000. In effect, it's a paid pilot, and we've done the installation already of the indwelling alarms, but we're just awaiting the PO for the connected part of this. And it's particularly interesting because this is a housing association, not a council, and the avowed aim of the housing association and of the local fire and rescue service is to link the alerts from our technology with the local fire and rescue. So that looks like being a particularly interesting case study if we can just further broker that link up. So no doubt we'll be talking about that again. One of the challenges with COVID, or disappointments for us, and we've all had challenges and disappointments through COVID, we know. We had a great start to the year. It came on a really strong second half of last year, and our start to the year wasn't accidental. It was hard work across the company and also by the board and the management team. So that was a particularly bitter pill after the difficult years we've had. On the other hand, we are returning, our momentum is returning. We're getting close to budget levels, but we are also reaching similar levels of sales to last year. And we are looking out to a really positive rest of the year, positive EBITDA performance in H2. But very significantly, for those of you who followed us, we have been challenged by our gross margin performance, and many of our improvements were due to really kick in second half, but they are partly volume dependent. However, we hope 4Q will start to show that our self-help measures are starting to bite. There's one aspect of COVID, though, is although it's delayed many of our plans and our opportunities, it did enable a lot of thinking time, and we do have a lot of work in the bag that should support next year. And again, further point on, we regularly update on board changes. This is about the 7th different movement in the last 18 or 20 months. There aren't many really high caliber tech directors in the UK. It's different in Silicon Valley, and Glenn is surely at the top of that list. So he's a really good addition to the board. And I must say, during September, we've had some great conversations with him, and he also with others in the management team. So we feel great about that. So let's carry on, and we'll come back to some of these points as we go through.
So moving on to headlines, and I'll explore some of these points in more detail as we go through the presentation, the individual slides on some of these. But in terms of headlines, firstly, revenues reduced by over £4 million to £16.5 million, and that's due to the impact of COVID lockdown restrictions, in particular, the inability of our trade and fire and rescue service customers to access domestic premises, and for our retail customers to access bricks and mortar retail premises. This has translated through to a loss before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization of 1.4 million, and has increased our operating loss for the half to 2.7 million. However, our gross margin has largely held up in the face of these headwinds by holding up at 22.2%. Our non-underlying charges for the period have reduced to just £200,000, and they relate solely to share-based payment charges in the period. And our capitalised product development spend amounted to 1.6 million as we focused development activities on those products that give the greatest payback in the shortest possible time. Our net debt at the 30th of June at the period end was 1.5 million, and that comprised cash at bank of 1.1 and an invoice discounting facility of 2.5. And that followed our fundraising in early April this year, before the impact of lockdown restrictions was truly known. In June, we secured a coronavirus loan, so a government-backed loan of £3.2 million through our existing bankers HSBC, and that was to address the reduced IDF availability and our pre-COVID stock purchase commitments. This was undrawn at the end of June, but was drawn down in August as planned, based on the impact of COVID-19. Moving to the income statement for the period, as I described, revenue fell by 21% to 16.5 million, and we'll explore the makeup by division of that reduction shortly. But crucially, we saw the impact of COVID-19 lockdown restrictions, bricks and mortar retail, and on FRS and trade ability to access properties, which disappeared overnight. This was particularly disappointing, as John mentioned, because the start to the year was very strong. Revenue was close to budget for Q1, and the gross margin was in line with our expectations. However, our online performance proved particularly resilient, with sales through Amazon proving particularly strong and encouraging, and we'll touch on that some more in a second. Our gross margin fell by 0.3% to 22.2%, largely due to the higher sterling costs of our US dollar denominated components. We have around 90% of our components denominated in US dollars, but also the gearing impact of those non-variable costs of sales, which just don't vary as sales levels vary, that base level of cost that you just can't avoid in a business. Although this downside was offset by non-cash mark-to-market gains in some of our forward contracts for foreign currency contracts at the end of the period. Our operating expenses were managed to 6.3 million, of which a big chunk, 1.9 million, actually relates to amortization and depreciation. As we flagged last year, we've accelerated the amortization of our connected home technology investment according to accounting standards. So effectively, we've got a bit of a mismatch in the P&L whereby we have the depreciation and amortization costs of that technology, but none of the or little of the benefit of the revenue that comes from that, because we've not yet commenced those rollouts that are key to the richer gross margin progression of the future. So overall, our loss before interest and tax was 1.4 million. Our underlying operating loss was 2.7 million. And you could look at this crudely by comparing to last year, and you can see that the 4 million COVID-related sales reduction has increased the loss by £1 million compared to last year, and unfortunately held back the actions in the gross margin improvement plan that is significantly dependent upon volume. Turning to the balance sheet, we've got a fairly simple balance sheet. I'll just give you a flavour of the key movements. Property, plant and equipment stood at 4.7 million, of which 1.3 million relates to capitalised property leases in accordance with accounting standard IFRS 16, which brought lease commitments onto the balance sheet for the first time last year. And we also have 2.9 million of capital equipment at our core key manufacturing, outsourced manufacturing partner, Flex in Poland, where all lines there are now producing to the required capacity, both now and when demand returns in the future. We have recorded capitalised development costs on the balance sheet of 11.6 million, as we invested a further 1.6 to complete our connected technology journey and products to meet future legislative change. And we also have pre-production setup costs when we transitioned from China to Poland to Flex of £1.6 million, which is being amortised down. As I said before, our net debt at the period end stood at 1.5 million, and that included a much reduced invoice discounting facility of 2.5 million versus the 7 million that we'd originally expected. And that's very much due to the impact, the material and immediate impact of COVID on debtor levels, therefore being available to draw down. So unfortunately and unexpectedly, the IDF availability was funded by the fundraise that stepped in to replace that value at that period. In June, we secured a CBILS loan of 3.2 million, as I mentioned before, and we drew this down during August as planned, and that funded the pre-COVID purchase commitments made in our procurement cycle. So we have a 3-month procurement cycle. So when the business was performing particularly well and in line with budget, January, February and half of March, we made procurement decisions based on us being in line with budget, which meant that significant amounts of stock were delivered June and July, which then had to be paid for in August. So we quickly identified the working capital tie-up as a result of the reduced sales and secured that CBILS loan to address that position. So to give some flavour around that, at June, at the period end, inventory stood at 9.4 million, and that was temporarily high due to those purchase commitments that remained unsold. But that inventory is in our high running lines, and we've changed the incentive arrangements for staff to ensure that that's sold down throughout H2 to reduce that value. Debtors stood at 6.4 million. They were unusually low. We would have expected those to be up at the near 9-10 million mark, but were a consequence of the reduced sales due to the lockdown restrictions. And those reduced debtors really impacted our ability to draw down on the invoice discounting facility. Creditors stood at 11.8 million, and they were high, and they reflected the purchase commitments that we made on the back of a great start to the year, January, February, March. And finally, our legacy battery warranty provision stood at 2.6 million, and that's expected to be utilised over the next 4 years in line with the modelling we've done with regard to that issue. Turning to cash flow, the group generated cash from operations before any non-underlying payments of £800,000. That was largely due to net working capital reduction of 2.2, driven by the sharp debtor reduction of 5.7 million as sales fell particularly quickly due to COVID-19, and that was offset by stock increases of some 3 million as purchase commitments remained unsold at the end of the half, as I described. We spent a non-underlying amount of £900,000 on free of charge products in relation to FIREANGEL's legacy battery warranty issue. And as I said, that was in line with our expectations when we commenced and finished the remodelling at the end of last year. As we previously described, we spent 1.6 million to complete the connected technology solution and the next generation of CO alarms in particular to meet future legislative requirements. In April 2020, we raised 5.5 million through an open offer and placing, which, as I described, was subsequently and unexpectedly used to offset the sharp £4.5 million reduction in invoice discounting facility that came about in April, May, June. And since that period end, we've secured that CBILS loan and drawn that down to meet the procurement cycle purchase commitments. So overall, fairly complex set of cash flow dynamics have led to an overall cash outflow of 1 million in the period. Net debt at the end of June of 1.5, but as I've said, that subsequently increased post period end as we've settled the liabilities that remained in the creditors balance in particular at the end of June. To give you some flavour of the impact of COVID-19 on the individual business units, this chart shows our sectors and compares the trade in H1 2020 to H1 2019. And here you can see that over 4 million reduction, 4.3 reduction due to lockdown restrictions. Give you a bit of flavour on the division. So trade in particular, Q1 20 sales and the margin were almost were ahead rather of last year. That sector was particularly impacted by lockdown restrictions, the inability to access properties. We expect to see momentum quickly return due to the contracts that we've previously signed with both councils and housing associations. And more recently, in August and September, those combined sales were actually 90% of last year, indicating pent-up demand and a recovery in customer behaviour. In retail, we talked earlier about the particularly pleasing online resilience. So Amazon sales of our product was actually up 15% on the comparative period last year. And the Q1 sales before the impact of COVID were close to budget, with the gross margin in the retail sector actually ahead of last year. Obviously a significant bricks and mortar impact as businesses remained closed. But that's improved significantly as things have reopened over the last weeks. August and September sales in particular are expected to be ahead of last year. And just touching on international, Q1 20 sales were significantly ahead of last year and were close to budget. Here we saw lockdown restrictions come in later and at varying degrees of severity and timing. Benelux particularly held up for us, as we saw significant legislative CO demand carried through from the end of last year. So international tailed off later with regards to COVID impact, but we are seeing that recover and pick up more recently.
Okay, and just noting some, well, really interesting questions, which hopefully we'll have time to get around to at the right moment. So, look, I've said we're not satisfied with margins, nor are our investors. So what are we doing about it? There are short, medium and long-term opportunities to drive up gross margin. The key thing that we would have liked to have bitten harder this year is, of course, around mix, and the trade market can command a higher margin than retail, quite simply. And social housing sits within that. That involves particularly our newer technology. And in order to kind of restore the momentum we felt we entered the year with, we are doing a lot to think through how we want to do marcoms for the rest of the year. And in particular, as we begin this rollout that we started the presentation with, then that has a significant power, and we will look to exploit that or leverage that in any marketing communications. In fact, tomorrow we've got an editor of one of the key publications visiting our offices to have a tour, and he is fantastically interested in this particular win. It's probably the largest domestic Internet of Things rollout wins in the UK so far for anyone in any sector, and it's news if you know in that sector. So we are particularly targeting that. Notably, one of the key decision points for this big rollout was the ability of our software, whereby each alarm is generating data. We can take that data in and assess the risk threshold for that property and create alerts that enable early intervention. Because you don't just get a fire normally, you get a build-up of alarm events that start to show a pattern and enable early intervention. So that was one of the key drivers for that decision. But it means we can charge a fee per month per dwelling. So to give you perhaps a bit more insight into this £1 million win, a typical property would have 5, 6, 7 devices from us of different types, smoke, heat and CO. And we would, each of them generating some data, and that might be, say, £250 per property to us as a capital cost or capital purchase price. But then we would have an ongoing charge each month ad infinitum for the connectivity and the software. One of the things we've been very busy on across the lockdown is delivering against our gross margin improvement plan. Part of that was to start to streamline our logistics. We did sign a lease on a new warehouse, moving down from 2 and a bit warehouses in the UK to 1, and that's well underway. Should enable us to spend less time shipping things between warehouses to fulfill a given single drop order and be a helpful minor downward pressure on stock. We have reviewed our stock keeping units. We said we'd do this. We had 220 at the start of lockdown. We've taken that down to about 170. It'll probably stabilize on about 180 and then trend down a bit further. We should end up with 150 to 160. And again, that should be an upward pressure on just our broad efficiency, but it means we just have less risk on stock, less risk of obsolescence in our stock, and we should be able to just move product through much more quickly. And indeed, feedback from the sales guys says this is making their job a little bit more easy already. Very importantly, we in the past, most of our packaging for retail was in that PET or plastic packaging. Now it's nearly all cardboard. That's working its way through. That should have a typical full year benefit, depending where we pitch the revenue next year, of £300,000 or £400,000 of gross profit. That's clearly valuable and should show up as one of the improvements in the GM, but that work is largely complete. It should assist our performance in the 4Q at the GM level. We have a lot going on in support and warranty. Our process there is very inefficient. It's very slow. It causes friction with our distributors. We've done a lot of work. It's not as advanced, though, in that case as I would like. And we're making further changes to make sure that that helps us next year. In the long term, our products were designed for, as most products are in this and many other sectors, for low cost employment economies. But now, even in Poland, you're seeing about a 6% annual wage inflation. And so the next wave in manufacturing is clearly around automation. Our current products are not very automatable, but as those reach the ends of their lives and gradually get replaced, which is a normal part of the life cycle, we will have designed them for an automated environment. And indeed, we're doing trials with a couple of robots on one of our lines in Poland. They won't have a big impact on what we do with that line, but clearly the way of the future is through more automated manufacturing. And I'd expect that to start to really contribute in 2022 onwards as the normal life cycle of products turns over. And so that's potentially very valuable. The key is we're not waiting on that. We think we can show marked gross margin progression quarter by quarter for some time through our self-help on operational efficiency and through really targeting this trade mix. Thanks, Matt. Probably now giving me a chance to answer a couple of the questions, but I'm struggling to read a couple of them from over here. Look, this social housing market, which we address through what we call trade, it's really big. The competitor that has most of this, like 80–90% of it, is called AICO, AICO. They're very dominant, very all but monopolistic presence there. And there are a number of reasons why we're ideally suited to go and attack that. We won a £180,000 social housing opportunity the other day with more, or week before last, with a more traditional alarms. We're very encouraged by that, by the way, because it was the first biggest order we'd had from some time, apart from the £1 million one. A good sign of COVID coming to an end. Reasons why, as per one of the questions, we were chosen: they like us better. We have good relationships going back many years. They in particular like the sensors that we use in our smoke alarms, and we have a better array of battery technology, battery alarms than AICO in the view of this customer. Our pricing was very competitive, but crucially, we were seen as future-proofed. So this customer, although not taking the software, very much likes the opportunity, which we will be going back to them with, to then add the software for a much better ability to manage risk in their social housing estate. So they like that angle, even if they're not buying it on day one. But in addition, they they like the fact that we are more future-proof from a connectivity point of view. And as our technology develops, we're very much aiming to include more sensors, not just smoke and heat and CO in the gateway, but include our own extra sensors and use standard technology that creators of other sensors in the Internet of Things could camp onto, meaning that our gateway, which you'd need for the alarms, can be used for other types of sensor, which is quite important. One of the key concerns of social housing is the ability to future-proof, because there's a lot of technology coming down the line, but the only thing that is absolutely mandated is an alarm. And once we've got the alarm in there, if you want a gateway, then we are clearly very well positioned, because if you want a connected alarm, then ours is the gateway, and therefore if that can connect to other sensors that help the social housing landlord discharge their responsibility and meet their and manage their assets better, then it puts us in a great position. So they did cite future-proofing as being key in the decision. So that hopefully hits that question. We think a typical product spend in these social housing, this big social housing market, is probably just going to be just over £200 a property. We do have examples where it's much higher than that, and in this first big rollout, it is certainly higher than 205. And by the way, to another question, no, it's not specially priced. It should be a very good commercial order for us, so we have no worries about that. Obviously, the software opens up a good recurring revenue opportunity for us. What we await is, although this first big win includes the recurring, includes the software and our ability to charge a small fee per property per month, we will feel much more comfortable in how that's going to develop once we've got another couple of customers on board. But if you think about it, with the development of the internet allied with the post-Grenfell regulatory framework, and even the comments by one of the fire chiefs who we know to a parliamentary committee yesterday about the importance of the digital environment in the social housing space, it feels supremely unlikely that this won't become very important, and that I'm sure we will be able to benefit. But my only question mark is how quickly we can really educate the market and camp onto that societal development. But the initial signs are clearly very positive. We have secured a very large win, which will, and one of the reasons is to use our software. Although I note we don't yet have the PO for the software, but it was the key reason for selecting our alarms. So, yeah, said that. I think I've covered that. It's a big opportunity. And what I think we should all note is our opportunity is unchanged by COVID. For a lot of industries, their opportunities have kicked out to the medium and long term, but the regulatory drivers for our opportunity are absolutely unchanged. And the public sector activity around this is undiminished, as per this parliamentary committee yesterday, as per things like the Hackett report that came out about Grenfell and so on. It very much speaks to the fact that our opportunity is probably undiminished and possibly even heightened.
John, just to cut in, obviously investors can't see the question, so if you are picking up, would it be possible just to give a readout of the question, just so that that they can put that into context? And sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's fine. So one question was, who are your main competitors and what differentiates us? I've just answered that. And someone asked, look, did you make that win through pricing in a showroom way to do a kind of loss leader? I won't read all of the question. Then the answer is no, we didn't. I would, and we're certainly going to consider that. But we wouldn't do it. We wouldn't do a loss leader for £1 million. But you know, if it was a £50,000 pilot, we would. On the other hand, we have a £50,000 pilot for which we've taken the order, as I mentioned, and no, we didn't do it as a loss leader. But I would consider that in order to get penetration up. And someone has asked, are the pipeline customers watching to see how the first contract goes, or are all the contracts on independent timelines? Well, this £1 million initial win is public sector. There are several other large London boroughs that are watching, and also the fire and rescue services are watching. So we do expect this to have a material influence, and hopefully we'll be reporting back in the new year. There clearly is a bit of a decision cycle for these things. I don't think the lockdown lost us 6 months. I think it lost us, you know, a year in progressing our funnel, and if you like, turning it back into the emerging pipeline that we felt we had in February and March. So yeah, seeing best practice is a strong influencer in the public sector. Going back to the person who asked about our differentiation against competition, however, we supply 90% of the UK's fire and rescue services with alarms for their home visits. We are known by them as the leaders in this connected space. They are very keen on moving from fire prevention to risk and human behaviour, and our technology, the ability to sample data and provide risk guidance, is very interesting to fire and rescue services, and they are very influential in large-scale social housing, fire alarm decisions. Very influential indeed. So it all kind of hangs together from that point of view. So that's that chart, I think, for the moment. We'll try another couple of questions in a moment, or as we go, perhaps. I'll come back to the questions. This chart really is trying to indicate progression. In 2020, well, we had hoped to be further ahead, but for COVID. But we do hope to start to show that we are delivering on some of our execution during 4Q. And if that goes as we hope, then we'll particularly highlight some of that progress after year end. We are starting to be able to articulate our market differentiation. That was the point of doing some significant market research. well, which is as thorough a piece of research as I've ever seen, but we are very well positioned to go at that social housing sector and to get the message absolutely right. We really now understand this segment of the market. Importantly, it's not just fitting an alarm to the ceiling. This is akin to low-level technology rollouts of the 90s and 2000s. We have had to learn from scratch how to do this. The thing is, if you're from IT, and a couple of us are, then you have an understanding of the fact that this is a project. It's not merely the creation and supply of an alarm for a contractor to put on the ceiling. It's a completely different thing, and we really know how to do it. We know better than anyone in this market how to do it. And it's been knowledge painfully won, and others will have to go through that learning cycle. We're about to commence our first real rollout, as we've discussed, but we're doing an awful lot to validate what the role data could play for us in the future, a lot. And we're having a lot of discussions with a data partner and with Fire and Rescue Services about their understanding of data. So we are really trying to understand a market that in effect didn't exist last year, and now it exists, and we're really trying to become, as you see on the far right, thought leaders, the people you go to if you want to understand about risk and human behaviour in this really big social housing sector. In the middle there, you see in 2021, we have to exploit what we've done. We've got to punch home the expected success of this rollout and really get penetration and take-up of our new products absolutely humming. And that will just show up in the GM and in further wins. That's where you'll see the success. We are becoming a technology company. What we do here in Coventry is not a traditional Midlands industrial activity. In Coventry, we do high-level design, we work on firmware, we work with the cloud, and we work with data. That is not an alarm company as we've all understood it. However, we've got now evidence that that is driving sales and cash and margin as next year progresses. So you'll see this shape of chart going forward. And then on to the final chart. We talk about outlook. We did a lot to adjust. Although it's been a disappointing half, in some ways there was a degree of satisfaction. We made a lot of a bad situation. We made a lot of progress, and that win is it's the gate through which everything can now happen. And a month into that rollout, we'll be calling 143 fire chiefs and assistant fire chiefs, who we do know by name. It's not just a database, and just drawing their attention to it, so they're fully aware that this leading edge approach is now happening in anger. Importantly, as I said, our self-help on operational improvements has not stopped, and we'll start to bite from now onwards. Even with no longer-term change to manufacturing practices, we will see that benefit next year, and even more so because of the expected mix improvement to high-margin products. The board is significantly changed. Currently, I think we're a good board. It's hard to have a good board. I feel that even when you get a good board, circumstances change and it's no longer a good board, but I'm very pleased with the shape we've got right now. And we are on the strategic path to revenue. We are learning a lot and executing a lot, and the whole company is really busy. It did not stop through lockdown. So we are definitely bullish about 4Q and excited about 2021 at the moment.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, John, Mike. Ladies and gentlemen, just while I give John and Mike opportunity to review the Q&A tab, I know that the guys have answered a number of questions throughout this meeting, but I'd just like to remind you that a copy of this presentation, a recording of it, along with the slides and the published Q&A will be available via your Investor Meet company dashboard. And I'd also like to remind you that feedback is important to the company, and immediately after the presentation has ended, you'll be redirected for the opportunity to provide your feedback in order that the company can better understand your views and expectations. I haven't gone through the questions, Mike and John, but if I could just hand back to you, and if you could could read out the question, if there are any that we haven't addressed in the meeting, and perhaps give your response, that would be great.
Okay. Someone's asked about, are we targeting what I think is the student accommodation sector? Not overtly. On the other hand, it's emerging as an area of interest. We have absolutely enough opportunity on our plate without targeting that, but there is also the potential to partner, and our software might indeed be of interest. So, yeah, it's interesting, but there's nothing directly in our pipeline or funnel that leads us very far in that direction. Another person is asking, who are your potential competitors in the connected home, and how do they compare, i.e. how far behind you are they? Look, it's very hard to say how far behind us they are. I've mentioned ACO, who dominate that trade market, but they were the supplier to this cancer where we've won, and they didn't get that business. So clearly they don't have a product, given that the software and the connectivity were the key reasons for the win. They clearly are not perceived as being anywhere near. On the other hand, they will get there. And by then we will have moved our product on. We will be the only people who've done any rollouts in this area. We still have our very strong relationship with the fire and rescue services, which is very influential. And we will be the only people who know how to do this. They will get there. I don't know if our lead is 1 year or 3 years. So it's there. Some people say, oh, well, you know, what about, you know, some of the big tech companies? Well, one of the things that protect us from, I don't know, Google entering alarms is this is a really, the barriers to entry to this market are really challenging. Because of the regulatory knowledge that is required. It needs to be almost visceral, and you need to build that up over many years. I just don't see a big player coming into this area from nowhere. On the software front, again, I don't know, our software works with alarms and it understands alarms. Again, you need that significant regulatory understanding that you only acquire through being in the market for years and years. So it feels like our most likely competition are the current traditional competitors of this market, but that's for the next 3 to 5 years. After that, who knows? At the moment, we feel like we're in a very strong place. Another question is, does the gateway require a connection to a tenant's ISP, or does it operate independently by utilizing the mobile data network? And that's a very good and actually even more difficult question than it looks. With this big rollout, the wireless gateway sits in a riser cupboard outside the in the hallway outside each tenant's dwelling. All the alarms obviously are in the dwelling, and they connect wirelessly to that gateway, which is again in a riser cupboard securely outside of their dwelling. And category 6 cabling has been laid in risers to a router from which it breaks out to the internet. But we don't use the ISP of the tenant. We could do. What we are discovering, given that we realise we have to do a site survey in effect of every tower block that we're going to roll out, the requirement of each social housing landlord will be different. The topology of each block and the architecture of each block and the materials will be different. And the existing infrastructure and cabling and riser structure will be different. So I think we'll end up with about 5 different ways of doing this, but we have the technology. In some cases, we have an additional gateway coming to market in 1Q, and that's a ceiling mount gateway. And normally I'd expect that actually to go in the tenant's own flat, and then that can be cabled, or it will have a SIM card, and we could use some kind of narrowband connectivity. But we think we'll end up with about, I don't know, we'll find there's about 5 typical ways of doing this, depending on each tower block. So it is different, but we're not using the tenant's ISP. And you know what? Something like 50% of people over 75, is it, don't have Wi-Fi. It kind of makes you think. There's, you know, not all of us are interneted up, really. Mention competition. I think that's really, unless I accidentally.
No, I think you've probably taken all of those questions there, John. Thank you very much indeed. Obviously, if we have missed any, we can review those after the meeting's ending. And as I've said before, we will publish all responses where it's appropriate to do so. I guess, Mike and John, thank you very much. Perhaps I could ask you just to wrap up. And then I know that investor feedback is important, and we will redirect investors to give feedback. So back to you to wrap up, and then I'll take the floor. Thank you.
Indeed. Well, the key thing is, I say again, that win is an absolute milestone. And us being able to issue our first recurring revenue invoice, even if it's only for 1 month for 1 flat for £1, you know, conceptually, feels like a massive validation. So a lot of roads lead through this, and we expect to be able to leverage it hugely. So that's vital. And then it plays to the fact that our opportunity is undiminished by COVID, and we've made a lot of progress behind the scenes and under the covers during the COVID period, and we've had a lot of time to really plan our strategy and our future. So we do feel really very positive about 2021.
That's brilliant.
Thank you all for listening.
Well, thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Mike, for updating investors today. Could I ask investors please not to close the session, as you'll now be automatically redirected for the opportunity to provide your feedback. If you access this meeting from our website, then the feedback page will appear. If you access the link by the email that we sent to you, then you'll be simply asked to log in and submit your feedback. It will take a few seconds, but we very much encourage you to do so. On behalf of FIREANGEL Safety Technology Group PLC, we'd like to thank you for attending today's presentation. That now concludes the session. A good afternoon to all.
Thanks. Thank you.